Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Great pleasure to be here today and present this paper, which is the very last of paper that I haven't published yet on my ERC project. And I forgot to update the date, but I updated the slides until this morning. So these are still ongoing work, and I'm eager to get some feedbacks from you. So this is joint work with François Fontaine and Julien Martin. Julien is a co-author for quite a bit of time. François Fontaine is a labor economist. And as you will see, it's not by chance that we teamed up with a labor economist. What we are going to do in this paper is to borrow a lot from the labor literature and apply some of their techniques to international trade data. So the general question that we are trying to address in this paper is on a question that is deep in, or that is there in a lot of debates in international trade, which has to do with the incidence of relative price shocks on firms and consumers. So if you think about a lot of debates that we have in international trade, a lot of the welfare consequences or the welfare questions that are tackled are related to this question of the incidence. For instance, in the context of trade policy, what is the impact of tariffs on either firms or foreign consumers? Recently, we worked a lot with Julien on the energy crisis, thinking about, again, the pass-through of energy cost shocks onto firms and then eventually consumers. So a lot of the debates have to do with this question. To just give a concrete example, there's now a lot of empirical evidence that are using the US-China trade war to discuss the impact of this type of tariffs. And this evidence points to quite some heterogeneity and asymmetry in the pass-through of those tariffs in this particular context. So in particular, the evidence is that there has been full pass-through of the tariffs that have been imposed by Trump on Chinese products entering the US. And if you look at the reverse, so the tariffs that have been imposed by China on Chinese imports, the pass-through is much lower. So this type of asymmetry is very clear in the context of the US-China trade war, but it's not very surprising because there's a lot of evidence that the pass-through of trade shocks is strongly heterogeneous across countries, products, time, etc. So this paper is going to dig into this question of the incidence. If you think of it, in theory, the ultimate impact of, say, a tariff shock on importers depends on two margins of adjustment. So in particular, the incidence is going to be a function of adjustment at the extensive margin, the extent to which the importer can switch away from those imports that are no more costly and switch towards either domestic or other foreign producers. And there's extensive evidence that this extensive margin adjustment are quite heterogeneous once again across products. And then even at the intensive margin, the degree to which the shock is going to be passed on to importers is likely to depend on a lot of characteristics of the product, and in particular, the strength of competition and the relative bargaining power of the firms that are involved into the transaction. So what we want to do is truly dig into these two margins of adjustment, and the way we are going to do it is by using a model of firm-to-firm trade that displays two main ingredients that are going to be key in shaping the adjustment of trade to relative price shocks. And these ingredients are search frictions and price bargaining. So the search frictions is going to be the ingredient that gives us some rich predictions regarding adjustment at the extensive margin, the extent to which importers at the moment when they're facing the shock are stuck or not into their trade relationship. And then conditional on the relationship surviving the shock, the price bargaining component is going to give us the predictions regarding pass-through and the adjustment at the intensive margin. So this is why we're focusing on these two ingredients. So more specifically, what I'm going to do in the next hour is to first give you an idea about the model, which is a dynamic model of firm-to-firm trade that, as I said, is very parsimonious. So the model is Ricardian in nature, so it's based on Eaton and Kortum. And to this model, we had a random search, as in Eaton, Kortum, and Kramer. And then on top of this, we have price bargaining, both within and between matches. So in our model, firms are going to match randomly, and then conditional on their existing network or the firms that they've matched in the past, they are going to be able to bargain about the price of the goods that they are purchasing in international market. We'll show that this model, even if it is very stylized, is able to reproduce a number of stylized facts that we observe in the data. The data that we are going to use are a panel of firm-to-firm trade relationships. So we observe every single transaction between a French firm and one of its partners in the European Union. And we are going to use the panel dimension of this data and show that a number of those, the stylized facts that we observe in this panel dimension can be reproduced with this very simple model. So in particular, one stylized fact that I'm going to insist on, which is specific to our model, has to do with the dynamic of prices, both within and across firm-to-firm relationships. So within a relationship, conditional on the relationship surviving, how do price evolve over time? And then how do price evolve conditional on a firm switching across suppliers? Yes? So
you're not dealing with any currency issues here?
No, no. Everything is going to be shocks to relative prices. And the reason why we don't dig into exchange rates, so basically we are going to use as shock to relative prices a shock to the real exchange rate. Our data are for France within the European Union, so we don't have a lot of nominal exchange rate shocks to exploit. So this is not going to be an important aspect. Most of the trade within the European Union, including with the UK or non-Euro member states, is invoiced in euros.
Yeah, it's just you pointed out this asymmetry between China and the US, and it strikes me that that may be due to some currency issues.
Yeah, potentially the invoicing currency is an issue here. So there's nothing I'm going to be able to say on that given the data at hand. So here the type of shocks that we have in mind is more like shocks to, say, cost of producing in France vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Or a tariff, but again, we don't have much tariff to exploit given the data. So that's the first part. I'll try to go relatively quickly on this, even though there's a bit of things to be discussed. Then the second thing that we do is to estimate the model structurally at the market level. So a market is going to be the interaction of a particular sector and country of destination. And we are going to estimate the model for 330 such markets. And what the structural model is going to allow us to do is to separate in the data the determinants of trade that are related to comparative advantages, so the kind of Eaton-Kortum baseline determinants of trade, versus search friction, so the extent to which it is difficult to match with foreign importers in foreign markets. I'll try to give you some intuition about how we go for identification, but basically what we're going to do is to exploit the mobility of importers along the supplier network that we observe in the data. And here you really want to think about this exactly as in the labor literature. So in labor, people are identifying frictions in the labor market from the observation that workers move from one firm to the other, and the frequency of those switches is used to identify such frictions. We're going to do the exact same thing in the context of a bipartite graph in which we are going to observe importers switching over time from one supplier to the other, and the rate at which importers are going to switch is going to be informative about the degree of such frictions in this particular market. Okay, so this is really how we are going to identify those such frictions. When we do this, we find that such frictions explain about a quarter of the cross-sectional structure of trade in our data. So 75% is explained by kind of standard Ricardian comparative advantages, and a quarter of what we observe in the data is related to these such frictions, the way we identify those in the model. And then the last thing that we do is to use the model and some additional estimates to quantify the incidence of relative price shocks in the context of this model. And the reason why we think this model is well suited to think about this question of incidence is that the model has rich predictions regarding both the switching rates and the pass-through conditional on a relationship surviving the shock. And in both cases, those rates are shaped by the interaction of such frictions, comparative advantages, and individual characteristics of the firm. So I'll dig into this statement a bit more later on, but basically what this means is that the model can predict a rich variety of incidence rate for a given shock just because of variation in those characteristics. So when we submit our data to the shock given what we've estimated before, we find that on impact, a 10% shock on the cost of producing in France is going to induce an overall incidence of on French firms' foreign partners that is equal to 20%. So 20% of the shock is passed on to foreign buyers, with about 2/3 of this effect being related to switches. So basically what happens in our model is that suddenly French firms get less productive or they're less competitive. And what we find is that given the existing network of their partners, a lot of those can immediately switch to no more competitive suppliers. So they're going to switch away from French firms in our experiment. But of course, these suppliers are more expensive. This is why in the first place, those people were purchasing the goods from French firms. And this switch towards more expensive suppliers is going to drive a large share of the adjustment of the 20% pass-through. And the rest is due to the fact that some firms that are good in terms of their bargaining power are going to be able to pass the shock onto their foreign partners and still maintain the relationship. So that's where this 20% incidence rate is coming from. And what we show as well is that, of course, this incidence rate varies a lot across markets, and in particular, we find it to be 75% higher in those markets that we estimate are more frictional. And the reason is that in those markets, when it's difficult to match with foreign partners, the importers that are facing the shock are going to be stuck with their existing partners, and this is going to reduce their bargaining power at the moment of the shock, and thus allow firms to pass a larger share of this shock.
Could I just ask again about the nature of the shock? I mean, is this a shock to all French firms? Or
Exactly. So the shock is really...
What should I think of?
So the way we are going to identify it in the data is by using shocks to real exchange rate, but you can think of this as a shock to cost. So say the minimum wage in France is increasing, and it's going to reduce the competitiveness of French firms vis-a-vis all foreign firms that they're competing with.
But you're including Eurozone countries in this?
Exactly.
Right? But so what is a real exchange rate shock between Germany and France?
It can be just, so for instance, we are working over the period of the 2000s. So during this period, relative unit labor costs have diverged quite extensively between France and Germany. So the real wages in France have increased vis-a-vis German competitors, and this has induced a divergence in competitiveness. So that would be one example of it.
But you can use that as an exogenous shock, the unit labor cost.
I mean, this is based on simulation, so we can simulate a cost without a problem. Then the changes in real exchange rate, we take them as exogenous from the point of view of the individual firm that is exposed to this shock. Yeah. Yes.
One clarification question: what is real differences in the degree of frictions across markets? Means in every sector, depending on the quantity of firms.
So the way it's estimated is by exploiting the fact that across sectors and countries, the rate at which importers are switching across suppliers is very different. And this is this heterogeneity in the frequency of switches that we are using to identify heterogeneity in frictions.
You have a kind of stylus factor. For example, the chemical sector is systematically more frictional, or
so I'm going to dig into this, but that's basically the type of idea that we are going to exploit. So the fact that the rate at which, so it's as if you were estimating frictions in the labor market in different local labor markets, and using the fact that, say, in Creuse, workers are less likely to switch across from one firm to the other than in Paris, which in this type of model would indicate that conditional on the rest, there are less frictions in the Parisian labor market than in the labor market in Creuse. I have no idea about the degree of frictions in different local labor markets, but that would be the kind of idea that we exploit. But I'll show you some evidence that those switching rates do vary across countries and sectors. Okay. So that's what for the overall roadmap. In terms of the literature, so there are a lot of papers that are related to what we do, and even more so since we keep on working on this. So first of all, there is a fast-growing literature in trade that is exploiting firm-to-firm trade data, as we do in this paper. And within this literature, there is also a growing number of papers using or interpreting this firm-to-firm trade data in the context of models that display search frictions. Okay, so this is basically this literature. In this literature, most of the time, the pricing strategies are very simple, like perfect competition, even though the markets are frictional. So here we are going to have a richer view on how these frictions affect the bargaining between firms in those markets. So from that point of view, this also establishes a link with this older literature that is digging into pricing in international trade data. Here as well, there is a lot of things, but the closest paper to us is this one that I already mentioned, which is digging into the pass-through of shocks in the context of firm-to-firm trade, and showing that in theory, the degree of pass-through strongly depends on the relative bargaining power of the firms that are involved into the transactions. So the exporter and the importer, and their bargaining power at the moment of the shock is going to be a key component explaining the degree of pass-through. So we are going to have the same type of predictions, but this model is static. We are going to dig into the dynamics of these markups and pass-through rates, both within and across relationship. And as I said before, we're also borrowing a lot from the labor literature. So what we do is basically a model à la Postel-Vinet-Robin. So with search frictions and on-the-job search under Bertrand competition. So this is what is going to generate this endogenous pass-through rate. The identification is very close to what is done in this paper by Rieder and Vandenberg. And the reason why we went for this type of identification is that in the literature in trade, or in this literature, most of the time the identification is based on the cross-sectional moments in the data, but now there are like a number of papers that have been written in this literature using this type of cross-sectional moment. And what we discovered, or what we know from this literature, is that it's very difficult to discriminate across different models by just using the cross-sectional moments of those firm-to-firm trade data. So that's why we moved on to using more the panel dimension, and in particular those switching rates, which we think are informative for identification of such frictions. Okay, so if there are no further questions on the introduction, let me just give you a very quick overview of the type of data that we are using. So as I said, we are going to use firm-to-firm trade data, and here we are basically taking what we have in France. So the data that we are using are exhaustive firm-to-firm export data that we recover from the French customs, and that describe for each single exporter in France all of its transactions with firms that are located within the European Union. And these are very good data because these are data that are collected for tax purposes. It's to calculate the VAT compensations across member states. So that's why it's limited to the European Union. And it's very detailed with a lot of data and a long panel. The data that we're going to use cover the period from 2002 to 2006, but we have pre and post sample data to control for left and right censoring. So if I need, I'll be more precise on this, but everything I'm going to show in the stylized facts is systematically controlling for these left and right censoring issues. We remove all trade intermediaries because the model is a model of direct trade between firms and their suppliers. And for each of those transactions, what we observe is basically the value and quantity for each French seller S, each buyer BI located in country I. We have information about the product that is traded at the detailed level, and the time dimension is at the monthly level. And when I'll talk about prices, I'll actually use unit values as a proxy for those prices. So unit values are just the ratios of the value over the quantity of the good.
Why do you focus in the 14 historical members? Is there a particular reason? Because that means that you are dropping out cheapest countries of Europe.
Yeah, so those member states are as a destination. So in terms of the production costs, we're always like focusing on France, and this is imposed by the data. The reason why we dropped the new member states is because we were focusing on this period, which is also the period when those countries were entering the European Union. And the problem, which could have been interesting, but the problem is that the data are collected from the day they're entering the European Union. So we don't have like the kind of historical data about their relationship to use and to control for. So that's why we cannot really exploit this part of the data, even though it's interesting as well. And then one question is why we don't use more recent data, but there are some threshold for some of the variables that we use. In particular, the product is very detailed above a certain threshold, and this threshold has been increased quite heavily in the early 2010. So that's why we prefer to keep data from an earlier period. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the dimensionality, so over this period of 5 years, we observed about 27 million transactions that involve a French firm and one of its partners in the European Union. This covers about 40,000 French exporters and 700,000 importers in the European Union. And together, these two populations of firms are going to form 5.6 relationship. And what we call a relationship is a sequence of transactions involving the same two firms over a particular product. Okay, so on average, we observe those firms interacting over 5 repeated transactions, and this is those repeated transactions that we are going to exploit to look at the dynamics of prices and quantities within a relationship. Of course, there is a lot of heterogeneity. A lot of those relationships are very short, and some are long-lasting, and we are going to take this into account in the analysis. So as I said in the empirics, when we are going to estimate the model structurally, one very important moment that we are going to exploit is about the mobility that we observe over time in this bipartite network. So what I'm showing here is the heterogeneity in this mobility. So what we do is to compute a number of probabilities at the level of each market. So for each sector times country, we compute the probability of various events taking place, and those histograms are showing the dispersion across sectors. So this goes back to your question, Eva. So here we are really showing the heterogeneity across markets. So now what do we do here? So take a cross section. So say here in January 2002, we observe a number of foreign importers that are interacting with a French firm over a particular product. So we are going to take this cross section and follow these importers until we next see them in our data, or a maximum of 1 year. So take all those guys and then look at them over a maximum of 12 months. And the next time I'm going to observe this firm, 3 things can happen, from this cross-section. The first possibility is that I see this guy again in the future interacting with the exact same French firms, which is what I'm going to call a repeat. So the transaction is repeated within the same transaction, within the same relationship, and this is what you have here in pink. Or I can also observe this same importer again in the future, but interacting with a different French exporter. And this is what I'm going to call a switch, okay, because the firm is switching across French suppliers. Or eventually I may never see this guy again in the next 12 months, and this is what I'm going to call a censoring. Okay, and those 3 probabilities are mutually exclusive, and they sum to 1.
Just one clarification question: the sectors are defined at 2 digits, 3 digits.
So it's so it's based at the 4 digits, and within a sector, relationships are defined at the most most detailed product level. So what do you see from this? First, the most likely outcome is that the transaction is repeated within the same relationship, and that this is not surprising. As I told you before, on average, I see firms interacting over 5 consecutive transactions. So it's rather likely that conditional on seeing a transaction, I see the guy a second time in the next year. But there is quite a bit of heterogeneity in the frequency of those repeats. And what I do see as well is switches or censoring. So switches here are from a French firm to another French firm, and censoring is the accumulated event that corresponds to either the firm just like, for instance, dying or exiting the market completely. But the firm can also switch away from French exporters towards another supplier that is not located in France, and thus that I don't observe. So now you see a bit how I'm going to identify such frictions later on. So what I'm going to use to identify such frictions that French firms are facing are those switching rates from a French firm to another French firm. And then I'm going to identify such frictions that other firms that are not in France are facing in the same market by these censoring probabilities. Of course, all of those probabilities are endogenous to a lot of things, so I'm going to need to put a bit more structure to the model to use those moments, but at the end of the day, these are really the moments that I'm going to exploit. Okay. So now let me go very quickly through the model. So the model is very simple. It's a partial equilibrium model that focuses on the many-to-one matching of some buyers and their suppliers. So the buyers are going to be the importers that I observe in the data. They say need to produce something, and in order to produce, they use some inputs, and this is the inputs that I'm going to focus on. These inputs, they are going to source them from sellers. Sellers can be located anywhere in France, in their own country, or anywhere else. I'm going to assume that those suppliers within a particular market J, they supply a homogeneous good at heterogeneous quality adjusted costs. So firms are going to offer on the market this product at a given quality adjusted cost, and the buyers are going to decide whether to purchase from one or the other. The buyers and the sellers are going to match randomly. And importantly, and that's the kind of new piece in this model, the sellers are going to be able to adjust their price dynamically to try retain their buyers.
So the sellers are just one product firms?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's how we are treating them in the data. So we are treating a relationship as the triplet seller, buyer, and product, meaning that the same seller selling two products are considered two independent firms. In the data, we do not see sellers interacting with the same firms over multiple products on average. So it's rather unlikely that the firm is going to sell two products to the same buyer in the destination country. And so that's why we treat those as two separate entities.
But you almost have quite big firms that almost always would have multi-products, right?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of them are multi-product. The key is that it doesn't seem in the data, and I don't have the statistic on top of my head, but in the paper we provide some statistics showing that basically there is no returns to search, in the sense that once you remove trade intermediaries, firms do not sell multiple products to the same partner. And so from that point of view, in terms of the search component, we can treat the search process separately across product market, which is what we are going to do. We could try to take into account more structurally those multi-product firms, but that would mean taking into account the interdependencies across markets, which is exactly. So this would be substantially more complicated. Here, because we treat those as independent units, we are going to be able to estimate the model market by market.
You are assuming no bargaining over prices.
Prices, yeah, I'm going to tell you about the structure of prices. So we assume Bertrand competition within the subset of suppliers that the firm has met. But I'll talk about this.
Sellers, we never bargain. There is no bargain at all.
You'll see, I call this bargaining, but let's discuss when I introduce the assumptions, so that I'm very clear about this, because it's a bit a question of vocabulary. But the prices are negotiated on each transaction as a function, between the seller and the buyer. So there are heterogeneous prices over all those transactions. Okay? So if I go step by step, so in my model, the buyers are going to be born unmatched. They exit at some exogenous rate. They face some demand for their variety. And in order to serve this demand, they need to produce. And to simplify and just stick with the assumptions in trade, but that's not very important, I'm going to assume that they're produced with a CS production function that involves some intermediaries. And these intermediaries, they can either be produced in-house, which is going to be like the outside option for all of those producers, or they can purchase them in international markets. Okay. So in international markets, they are going to be matched with populations of sellers on each market. And as I said, everything is going to be separated across markets. So one such market is the market for input K, say chemical products. And so this buyer needs chemical products in order to produce its own output. And there are a number of sellers that can offer these chemical products. So these sellers, they are located in any country. They can be located in I, or they can be located in France or anywhere else. In the rest, I'm only going to separate between French and non-French sellers. And they produce a single output at some quality adjusted cost here. Okay, so C is for the quality adjusted cost. Then in this market, search is going to occur simultaneously on each market separately. And there will be a single constant probability that a buyer from I meets with a seller from some country F bar in this particular market. And these are the probabilities that we are going to estimate afterwards. So these are the search frictions that I'm estimating afterwards. So importantly, those probabilities are constant, whatever C. So firms are not kind of endogenously searching for good partners. They just are matched randomly based on these probabilities.
But do you see the buyers matching with non-French firms?
No. So we are going to infer this from our data, and I'll explain how, but it's basically these censoring probabilities that I talked about that are going to be informative about those parameters. What we see is like buyers matching with French partners. Okay, and then once you've matched with a number of sellers, you can pick which supplier to source your input from. And here, so for instance, suppose that this guy has met with 2 partners here. BI is going to choose between those based on their quality adjusted cost. So in equilibrium, BI is going to choose the best seller among the subset of firms that they have met before. And then they are going to start the relationship whenever the price that is offered by the supplier is below the reservation price that is obtained while producing in-house. Okay, so that's how the model basically works. So on the supply side, the model is Eaton and Kortum. I don't know how familiar you are with Eaton and Kortum, but everything here is completely standard. So firms are producing under constant returns to scale with some efficiency that is random and some quality that is random as well. Afterwards, I'm not going to be able to separate between both, so I'm going to assume that the quality adjusted productivity, this Z term here, is random and distributed Pareto with some shape parameter theta here. So this is the cost of serving market I from, say, France for a product J by a firm that has received this quality adjusted productivity. And so this cost is a function of the, say, wages in France, the iceberg cost induced while serving market I from France, and this random component that is Pareto distributed. So this is the beauty of Eaton and Kortum. When you're ready to make these assumptions, you find that the cost of serving a particular country can be, or the distribution of those costs can be written in a very simple way as only a function of the production cost and the trade barriers here. And you can do this for every country. So this is the distribution of cost for firms that are located in France, and this is the distribution of cost for firms that are not located in France. And you can see that those distributions look like the same, and they can be written as a function of each other. And this involves this term here that I'm going to call comparative advantage. So this is really the Ricardian comparative advantage that Eaton and Kortum put at the center of their model. And this is basically a measure of how costly it is to serve a market from France versus from the rest of the world. Okay, so in the rest, I'm going to estimate those Ricardian comparative advantages. And when I'll talk about this, I mean that I'm going to estimate this term here for each market. Okay, so that's completely standard. The additional part that I added to this model is the buyer-seller matching. So as I said before, there are some buyers in each country. They meet with French or non-French sellers at some constant rate. So overall, they meet with partners at this rate here. And then, so this means that over time, they are going to kind of accumulate knowledge about the market and accumulate a larger and larger network. And the sellers are going to try maintain their links with the buyers until either the buyer dies, which happens at some exogenous rate nu, or until the buyer decides to switch, which is endogenous. Okay. So conditional on the structure of the network, the sellers in each buyer's network are going to Bertrand compete, exactly as in Bernard, Eaton, Jensen, and Kortum, or in labor as in Postel, Vinet, Robin. The key difference with respect to the assumption that is used in labor is that we are going to assume that the so the bargaining here, so what I'm calling bargaining is actually Bertrand competition, is done for each transaction without any commitment for the future. So basically at each transaction, the buyer is going to observe its current network and then pick the best suppliers within this network and then bargain with this supplier without committing beyond the current transaction, which is very important because in labor, basically what happens is that you're bargaining at the moment when you get employed, and the bargaining involves a forward-looking component because once you decide to go in that particular firm, you just like give up all your outside options. Here it is not the case. We assume that the transaction or the buyer's network remains even once you start a relationship with a supplier. And that means that everything is going to be backward looking. So basically the structure of the level of prices is going to be entirely determined by all the matches that you've done in the past.
One question, so it's a one period relationship every time?
So the relationship can be long lasting, but the price evolves over the relationship because there is no commitment beyond the next transaction.
And when you talk about, because you already talked several slides ago about the best seller or the best supplier. From the buyer's point of view, your best seller is the one with whom you will have the largest surplus.
Yeah. So that's exactly, so
you wait until you find that one, or as soon as your surplus is positive?
As soon as your surplus is positive, you start the relationship. But as soon as you find somebody better, you switch away from that relationship. So that's in that sense that everything is the reason why everything is very simple is because everything is backward looking. Given the structure of your network, you can always go to the best supplier in the sense of the one that is going to generate the largest surplus. Okay, so
there's no kind of relationship capital.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's a very important element and eventually something that we might want to extend in the future, but that would complicate things dramatically because it would add a forward-looking element in the problem. Okay, so suppose that I'm a buyer and in the past I've met with n potential suppliers for the good. Now I can always rank those sellers according to their quality adjusted cost. So the best supplier is C1 and the worst is Cn. So in equilibrium, the transaction is going to take place with C1 because the goods are homogeneous. So I always go for the cheapest supplier. And what we know as well is that this best supplier is going to be able to set the price, which is just sufficient to beat the second best supplier. So that's the Bertrand competition structure, which means that in equilibrium, the price of the transaction is going to be the quality of the best supplier times the cost adjusted for quality of the second best. Okay, so you just bargain up until the buyer is just indifferent between you and the second best supplier. And again, these prices can be renegotiated over time, either when there is a shock, which will be what I focus on at the end of the talk, or even when the buyer meets with a new seller. So whenever I match with a new supplier, I can always use this new supplier to renegotiate on my existing relationship. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of the dynamics of prices? So suppose I'm starting from this period T, I'm BI connected with this guy, the price is that, and now with some probability I'm going to match with a new supplier. What does it imply for the price dynamics? So this of course depends on where this guy ranks in the overall ranking of those suppliers. So the first possibility is that this guy is not good. And in that case, nothing happens, as the new supplier is neither the best supplier nor the second best. So in that case, nothing happens, and this guy is just kept in memory in case the ranking of those suppliers changes in the future. Of course, the likelihood that this guy is not good enough to beat your existing supplier varies over time. Endogenously, you're going to match with better and better suppliers, which means that the probability that the relationship is going to survive is going to evolve over time. And this is how we are going to match what we see in the data, which is the hazard rate of a relationship. So this is what we've computed from our firm-to-firm trade data. And what you see from this is that the probability that the relationship, that the firms separate, that the relationship ends, is very high at the beginning of the relationship, at about 40%. So conditional on the first transaction, the probability that there will not be a second transaction is as high as 40%. But over the beginning, I mean, very quickly, this hazard rate goes down. And after, say, 6 to 10 months, it starts stabilizing at a substantially lower probability. And then in our model, it's going to converge to mu. So this is how we are going to calibrate mu in the empirical part. So we observe the steady state level here, which is about 4%, and that's what we are going to use to calibrate mu. Yes?
How do they pay the search cost if there's perfect competition?
So here there's no search cost. It's just like random search. Over time, you just receive information about potential suppliers. So there's nothing to pay for this.
And then just a follow-up question on that. So do you absorb for the demand shock or taste shocks that the buyers may have for goods, or does it get reflected in the search friction itself?
So we don't have this in the model. We don't have such shocks. I'm trying to think about how they would affect our... So potentially they could induce some additional switching. That's what you have in mind, I guess. So you'll see. Then that would have consequences also for who you're switching to. And I'm going to have a stylized fact on this. Okay.
What I had specifically in mind was that if we see that for a particular sector and country, the search cost is high, does it really reflect the fact that it's really hard to enter the market, or is it that those buyers have a preference for other firms or specific firms?
I mean, the model has perfect substitution between suppliers, so there's no way I can directly address your question, because we don't have, I mean, these demand shocks would only affect the quantity that is purchased, but not the identity of who you're purchasing from in the context of our model. In another model, it could be true that you're switching not only because the guy is better, but also because, I don't know, it's offering something that you're not going to find here. That's possible. The way we are handling this is that we are working at the most possible disaggregated level, which is 10,000 different products. And then, as I'll show you, there are systematic patterns in how firms switch that are consistent with our model that I don't think would be consistent with the model that you have in mind. So that's what I meant here.
One clarification question. The endogenous, because there is exogenous switching, the exogenous, right? And the endogenous switch can only happen if there is a new supplier that enters the market.
Yeah, or if there is a shock to your current supplier that makes your current supplier willing to, I mean, that affect the ranking. But in the context here, in the example I gave, the reason why there is a switch is always that you've met with a new partner.
So why is it important that you remember the previous meetings you had? Like you said, you remember all the.
So in practice, it's not very important that you remember them all. We can just assume some kind of loss of memory, and you're forgetting about those that you've met in the long past. What is important is that the level, I mean, basically your bargaining power at the time of a transaction is affected by the history of the matches that you had before, even if this history is constrained to be only 1 year or 2 years or whatever. But what matters a lot is that over time, and that's what we are going to show in the data. Exactly. So, and this also means that by aging, you get more bargaining power, and you're going to be able to renegotiate your price down over time. And that's something that we observe in the data. Okay, so this hazard rate is one kind of moment that we can reproduce in our model. But as I said, it's also possible that this new match that you, this new guy that you just matched generates a switch. And this happens if the guy is better than all your existing suppliers. In that case, what happens to prices is ambiguous in the context of our model because of quality differentiation. So here you can switch to a guy that is better either because its cost of producing is lower or because the quality of its goods is better. The reason why we introduced in the model this quality differentiation is because in the data, when we observe a switch from one French firm to another, it's almost equally likely that you're going to switch to a lower price than to a higher price firm. So that's the reason why we needed this quality adjusted cost. Otherwise, we would have gone to a standard Eaton-Cortu model where switches would be generated by differences in cost. Okay, but in the data, that's not what we observe. So just closing on this is the density of price changes conditional on a switch. And as you can see, it's centered around 0. And this is also something that has been found in US data. Okay, so that's conditional on a switch. But when we see a switch, and that goes back to your question, what we can see is that switches always go towards better firm in the sense of firms that display lower quality adjusted costs. That's a prediction of our model that we also match in our data. And the way we do this is by first estimating quality adjusted costs within our model. So that's this term here. And then conditional on, once we observe quality adjusted cost, what we see very clearly in the data is that switches are always kind of inducing the buyer climbing the kind of quality ladder that we are estimating. So conditional on a switch, you don't switch randomly, which would happen in the context of your model potentially, but you tend to switch towards sellers that we estimate are better. So over time, you're going to improve the quality of your match through those switches. Okay, so that's when there is a switch associated with the new match. And the last option is that there is no switch, but now you're going to use this new match to renegotiate with your current partner. And this is perhaps the prediction that is the most interesting to us, given what we observe in the data. So then in that case, the match does not involve a switch, but there is a renegotiation of the price over the relationship. And that's also something that we observe in the data. So here what we are estimating is the dynamics of prices within a relationship, so using the sequence of transactions that involve the same firms. And we find a tendency for prices to be renegotiated down over time, which is consistent with our model. Okay, and in the appendix, I don't have the button here, but we show that this downward trend is very robust. We condition on the overall tenure, so we separate between long-lasting and short-lasting relationship and find that this relationship holds whatever the type of relationship. Okay, and that's also something that the model is going to reproduce very easily. As I said, the reason is that the model has this kind of very deterministic aspect whereby when you age as a buyer, you're going to keep on matching with firms, and this is going to improve over time your bargaining power, and that's how you're going to be able to renegotiate prices down. But what is interesting as well is that in the context of this model, the extent to which you're going to converge towards the best supplier in the world strongly depends on the level of frictions. If overall you tend to match with new suppliers very often, then you're going to accumulate a very good knowledge of the market quickly, and this is going to help you negotiate prices down very quickly. While instead, if the market is very frictional, then prices are going to, the dispersion of prices across transactions is going to remain high even after a long period of and a long experience. Okay. So I'm going to go very quickly on the rest of the model, which is very nice, I think, but not so interesting. But basically what we do is that we can solve the model in the steady state. And in this steady state, we recover a full characterization of the distribution of suppliers. So here, basically, what happens is that you have the Eaton-Kortum structure, which is summarized by those distribution of serving costs, but no frictions are going to distort the structure or the distribution of cost within a particular buyer's network. And the mapping between those two distributions is what we have here. So basically what happens is that if you're in a market that is very frictional, the distribution of the people that you've met in the past is going to differ quite heavily from the underlying distribution of cost in this market. And this is going to induce an inflation of cost on average. So basically in frictional market, on average, you're going to pay higher costs just because you're going to match with limited number of suppliers with higher cost on average. And the last thing that we can solve from is the structure of trade in this model. So the pie here is going to be the share of a particular buyer's consumption that is sourced from France or from the rest of the world. So these are the trade shares in this model. And we can solve for those trade shares analytically and also show that conditional on those trade shares, the distribution of cost is the same whatever the origin of the supplier. So what this means here is that this pie is equal to the probability that I end up with a French firm. And it's also the share of French products in my overall input purchases on average. Okay? And what you can see is that we have a very simple formula for those trade shares that involves solely two determinants of trade, which are Ricardian comparative advantages. So this is the Eaton-Kortum part of the model. We have the exact same predictions that if French firms have a comparative advantage in, say, chemical products, on average, they are going to amount to a larger share of all countries' consumption. But on top of this, we have this kind of distortion that is induced by such frictions, whereby if it is relatively easier for a French firm to meet with a partner AJ in comparison with its competitors, it's also going to increase on average the market share of French firms. Okay, so now we have a model of trade that has two key determinants for the structure of trade: Ricardian comparative advantages and relative matching frictions. And because we have this very simple characterization of this, we are going to be able to estimate this and that separately and measure what is the share of the variance in trade flows that is induced by such frictions versus comparative advantages. Okay? That's basically the model. So now in terms of the estimation, so as you said, everything is very simple, and that's really the beauty of having everything backward looking, is that we have analytical formula for everything. Still, there are a number of challenges that we need to take into account to estimate the model structurally. The first one, I often get questions from trade people on this before I arrive at that stage of the presentation. But until now, I've kind of ignored the fact that firms do not need inputs on a continuous time, but instead transactions are themselves kind of infrequent. And given the type of moments I'm using, the switching rate, these transaction rates can be important as well. So what that means is that both switches and new matches are going to be observed only conditional on a transaction. If you met with somebody but you don't need the input, there is no way I can observe this in my data. So in order to take this into account, I'm going to augment the model with infrequent transactions. And to simplify things, I'm going to assume that transaction rates are also determined by some exponentially distributed, they are also exponentially distributed. And I'm just going to simplify to assume that there are two rates of transaction in each market. So with some probability, you get a low rate of transaction, and with some probability, you get a high rate, we could have more than 2 transaction rates. It happens that we match the transaction frequency quite well with only 2, but that could be something that we may improve upon if we wanted. So that's the first thing, and it's solved in a way that is a bit mechanical, basically by assuming that these 2 events, like matches and transaction, are orthogonal to each other. We can very easily augment the model with this. The second element, which is more complicated conceptually, is that we only we do observe some switches, but we don't know whether when we observe the same firm interacting with a French firm at time t and then with another French firm at time, say, t+6, there has been switches in between that either have not involved any transaction or eventually were not observed because the switches has been went to a non-French firm. So we need to take into account the fact that we only observe those switches that are related to a transaction with a French firm. And so the way we are going to take this into account is by using a simulated method of estimation. And the final thing is that in our estimation, we are not going to rely on measured prices or quality adjusted costs, because it's well known that these are variables that are mismeasured, so we don't want to put too much weight on these moments in our estimation. So overall, in order to kind of account for all of these challenges, what we decided to do is to estimate the model by simulated maximum likelihood under unconditional inference. So the simulated element is going to help us take into account the fact that we don't observe all switches. We use unconditional inference so that we don't need to condition on a particular price. We can integrate over the whole distribution. And yeah, that's it. So this is where we are taking inspiration from this paper by Vandenberg and Rideau. Okay, so the rest is just like kind of cooking, and usually it's where the decision on this cooking is important. So I told you that we are going to estimate Ricardian comparative advantages and friction separately. The way we are going to do this is by using the fact that in our model, there is a mapping between those conditional on trade shares. So we are going to observe trade shares, estimate frictions, and from this we'll have comparative advantages, which means that the vector of parameters that we need to estimate for each market is constituted by those 5 parameters. So 2 search frictions for French firms and non-French firms, 2 transaction rates, and the mu, the exogenous separation rate. So as I said, we are going to identify transaction rates from transaction frequencies, switching rates from switching frequencies. And the last thing that we cannot identify separately from this, so basically I told you at the beginning that we are going to use censoring rates to identify those gamma F bar, so the probability that the firm has matched with a better firm which is not located in France. But we cannot identify this separately from the mu. So as I told you before, the mu we are going to calibrate from the steady state hazard rate. And then we are going to use the censoring rate to identify the gamma F bar. Okay? Yeah.
In case the search frictions are also correlated with geographical trade cost, would you have to have a new estimating equation for the trade elasticity?
No, so this we can handle. So basically, we are not imposing any orthogonality between this and that. And actually, we are going to find that this is correlated with distance, which we also think is correlated with that. So basically, we estimate this kind of independently from switching rates. And then we have the trade shares, and this is how we go to this. But we don't impose orthogonality between both. Okay, so I have only 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go very quickly on the results and then finish with the question of incidence. So as I said, we are going to estimate frictions and Ricardian comparative advantages over a bit more than 300 different markets. And as I said as well, in the context of our model, those two parameters are going to determine the structure of trade. So now we can use this to measure how important search frictions are for trade. In the context of our data, we find that 23% of the variance in trade shares is explained by search frictions, and the rest is due to Ricardian comparative advantages in the context of our model, so about 24%. In Eaton, Kortum, and Kramer, they estimate kind of the same type of parameters, but using the cross-section purely, and they find that it's about half and half, so half of the variance of trade is due to matching frictions, and the rest is due to kind of iceberg cost. We find a smaller contribution of matching frictions or search frictions with an empirical strategy that uses a very different moment in the data. We find that most of this is explained by heterogeneity across countries. So basically, the product dimension is not very does not induce much variation in search frictions. But what we find is that almost all of what we find is due to heterogeneity within a sector across origin countries. Okay, so the cross-country dimension is very important in driving the heterogeneity in our data. And finally, we find, sorry, it's a 0.7 elasticity. We find a very strong correlation between distance and frictions, which might not seem surprising. In trade, we know that gravity matters, and the structure of trade is very much affected by distance. Usually the way we interpret this is by saying trade costs vary with distance. What we find is that such frictions are also very much affected by distance. What does it mean? It means that for a French firm, it's much easier in relative terms to match with a partner in, say, Belgium than in Finland, for reasons that maybe is related to culture or historical ties or whatever. But I mean, we have this very strong correlation in our data. Okay, I'm going to skip. So this is some statistics about targeting the moments. Perhaps more interesting is this table that features some non-targeted moments. And there I'm starting to slowly move back to the question I had at the very beginning. So as I said before, the model has very rich predictions regarding switching rates and pass-through rates conditional on no switch. So this is the pass-through rates that we are going to use here. And there we are going to compare what we observe in simulated data based on our estimates and what we observe in actual data. So in actual data, we are going to estimate within a firm-to-firm relationship the pass-through of real exchange rate shocks to prices. So that's how people who do in trade to estimate empirically the pass-through. And in the simulated data, what we do is that we take our model, estimate it for each market, and then we simulate a cost shock affecting all French firms, and we look at what the model predicts for the transmission of this shock to foreign buyers in the context of our model. And this is what we find. So basically, the first thing that we find in the data, which we can also reproduce in the model, and that I think is somewhat new in this literature on pass-through, is that the degree of pass-through varies across markets as a function of the market share of French firms in that particular market. So basically, we find higher degrees of pass-throughs in those markets in which French firms have a larger market share. And in the context of our model, it's due to the combination of comparative advantages and relative meeting rate. So that's basically the first thing. When we dig further into the model has a clear prediction, which is that the relative meeting rate, so how easy it is to match with French firms relative to non-French firms, has an impact on pass-through. And the reason why it is the case is because conditional on facing the shock, you're going to be able to negotiate over the price if you can use other suppliers in your network that have not been affected by the shock. So here it's very important that the shock is common across all French firms and deteriorates their competitiveness in relative terms with respect to non-French firms. And because of this, the composition of your network and how many French firms there are on average in your network is going to be very important as a predictor for the pass-through. So that's what we're testing here in column 7 and 6. What we find is that the pass-through rate is substantially larger in those markets that we estimate display relatively high meeting rates, so those that are closer to France, Belgium, etc. And in the context of our model, it is true because on average, if relative meeting rates are high, that means that most of the competitors of your current suppliers are French themselves. They are hit by the same shock. And because of that, you can pass the shock easily to your partner. While instead, if you need to retain your buyer and your competitors have not seen their price, their competitiveness deteriorate, then you'll have a strong incentive to absorb the shock. And that's something that is very strong in the data as well. The final thing, and then I really need to move on, is that our model, I told you, has also a direct kind of premium to experienced buyers. And the reason is that experienced buyers, they know the market better, they have a larger network, and because of this large network, they can basically negotiate better at the moment of the shock. So that's why you see that the pass-through is smaller for firms that, or for buyers that are more experienced, and we find this in the data as well. Okay, so let me conclude with the question that I started with, which is this impact of relative cost shocks and the incidence that they have. So as I said, this model has a rich theory of both pass-through rates and switching rates as a function of the structure of competition in the market that is shaped by such frictions and comparative advantages, and also individual characteristics. And I'll illustrate this by simulating a shock and showing what is the impact of this shock depending on these characteristics. So when I simulate this shock, so I do a kind of homogeneous 10% cost shock to French firms, and then I look at all those buyers that at the time of the shock are matched with a French firm. What happens to those guys on impact? This is the kind of pink or dark pink bars that you have here. So there are 25% of buyers that are going to immediately switch away from French firms. So basically they have in their network an alternative supplier that is not French and that is good enough so that they can, it's better to switch towards this new firm, and that's what happened on impact. Conditional on no switch, there are basically two things that can happen. Either the firm second best supplier is French or it's non-French. If it's non-French, then in order to retain your buyer, you have no choice but to absorb the shock entirely. And that means that there will be no pass-through of the shock onto your foreign buyers. Or your competitors are mostly French, and in that case, they are all hit by the same shock, and then the shock is entirely passed on to the buyer. So that's why you see the model can predict rich degrees of pass-through, because depending on who is the second best supplier, your pass-through strategy is going to be radically different. What does it mean in terms of incidence? It is not because you can switch that the incidence is zero. Of course, if you were not interacting with this firm before, it's because it's more expensive. So what does it mean in terms of the incidence? And then I'll stop with this. What we find is that on impact, on average, across markets, the incidence of the shock is equal to 23%. So meaning that the 10% shock affecting all French firms is going on average to induce a 2.3% increase in the price of buyers that were initially matched with French firms, okay? A 23% incidence rate. That is mostly attributed to the extensive margin. I told you a lot of firms, 25% of firms immediately switch, but conditional on switching, they go to a more expensive firm, and thus this induces an increase in prices. The rest is due to firms that do not switch, and on top of this, need to incur 100% or less than 100%, but substantial pass-through rate. What we find as well is that the incidence varies a lot across markets, depending on the degree of friction. So you see here this incidence on impact that you can compare. So from this market, which display low meeting rates, so very high frictions from the point of view of French firms, towards those markets in which French firms are kind of at their comparative advantage in terms of such frictions. And you see that the incidence rate is very different. Why it is the case? Because in those markets in which gamma over gamma bar is high, basically buyers are very badly equipped. They're mostly having their network French firms. And so these are the ones that are going to support the full pass-through on impact. What you see as well is that there is a bit of a dynamic. Over time, the incidence rate is going down quite substantially. And this is mostly driven by high frictional or high gamma over gamma bar markets. Because over time...
Sorry, how persistent is the shock?
So this is a permanent shock. So in the context of Bernard Eaton Jensen Kortum model, the shock would immediately push all firms away from French firms, and then the incidence would be at steady state immediately. Here, the adjustment or the kind of dynamics is entirely due to the fact that we have these frictions that kind of complicate the ability of firms to escape from those now expensive French firms. And as you can see, this dynamics is very high in those markets because at the moment of the shock in those markets, firms are basically stuck with bad French firms, and it takes time for them to be able to escape. Okay? I'm going to stop here. I don't want to run out of time. I hope I convince you that this model, even though it's quite simple, very stylized, is useful to think about incidence and how such frictions affect this incidence of shock. We have this kind of novel way of estimating these frictions. Of course, there are a lot of things that we might want to do. In particular, we talked about this. Maybe in the future, it might be nice to also think about kind of relationship-specific investment that induced a bit more like stickiness in relationship. Here, we are really working in a world in which there's no stickiness at all. You can very easily switch away from your partner. So the only impediments to switching away is due to such friction, so who you know at the moment of the shock. But in reality, we know that there are a lot of kind of long-lasting relationships that are eventually affected by some form of contractual rigidities. So this might be a very interesting avenue for future research. For now, we don't have this, and I'm going to stop here.
Okay, we have time for one question, so you know. All right, well,
I'll
go
take
ahead.
that question. So, very interesting paper, obviously. There are plenty of things going on. One additional thing which I had in mind was, can we see heterogeneity in terms of whether the buyers are downstream or whether these are upstream firms, just to see whether these pass-through could differ?
So clearly we thought about, I mean, again, that's a bit the reason why we decided on estimating those market by market. And so we were a bit agnostic about what we were expecting, but I mean, it's true that we were expecting a bit more heterogeneity across sectors, which is your question. In our estimates, at least this version of our estimates, we find that most of the action or most of the heterogeneity is across countries within a sector. And we don't find a lot of, and even when we look at the average degree of frictions, we find that basically those markets in which on average French firms are at their advantage in terms of such frictions are basically sectors in which French firms are well known, so beverages, transport materials and stuff like this. So meaning that what we usually interpret as the comparative advantage of French firms might to some extent be linked to their kind of notoriety and the fact that they are well known in those sectors. But again, statistically speaking, most of the heterogeneity is across countries more than across products.
All right, well, thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week.